Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm happy to greet you here at the 11th conference of the Valdai Discussion Club. It has already been said here that this year the Valdai Club has new co-organizers, including some of Russia's non-governmental institutions, Russia's leading universities and think tanks. In addition, there was an idea expressed to add issues of global politics and the global economy to the issues of Russian development. I'm sure that these items on the agenda will strengthen the role of the Valdai Club as an important discussion platform. I also hope that we'll be able to preserve the so-called spirit of the Valdai Club, as in the openness, independence of thought, and the opportunity to speak your mind even when your ideas are not very orthodox. And I can tell you that I will not disappoint you either. I will speak bluntly and sincerely. Maybe some things I'm about to say will seem too harsh to you, but unless we speak our mind truly and openly, then it would be no point to meet in a format like that. And maybe it would be better to meet within a diplomatic format where no one says anything specific, and rephrasing the words of a prominent diplomat. You know, diplomats have a tongue to avoid speaking the truth. Well, we're not like that. We actually gather here to speak our minds, and we need some harsh and truthful assessments, not in order to debate with one another and point fingers, but in order to figure out what's been going on in the world and why the world has become ever less predictable and more prone to risks, and why the risks are increasing everywhere. The issues of this year's discussion have already been enumerated, and the overall theme of this year's meeting of the club is the new game rules, or a game without rules. This basically outlines a choice that all of us will have to do. The point that today's world is rapidly changing is nothing new. We all know it, and of course this has been already voiced so many times. It is difficult not to see fundamental transformations in global politics, the global economy, social life, technology, and so on. I would like to apologize in advance for repeating some of the participants in their speeches, but I believe it's impossible to avoid that, because they did speak at length and in much detail, and I'm just expressing my opinions. I might actually agree with some of the things said by some of the participants, or disagree with others. But let's not forget analyzing the present state of affairs. Let's not forget the lessons of history. You know, changing a world order. And this is exactly what we're witnessing today. Usually, such changes would be accompanied, if not by a global war or conflict, confrontation, then at least by a series of local conflicts. Secondly, global politics are primarily about economic leadership, issues of war and peace, and humanitarian issues, including human rights. There have been a lot of contradictions building up in the world, and we need to ask one another in good conscience whether we have a good insurance against confrontation. Unfortunately, there are no guarantees that the existing system of global and regional security is capable of securing us against turbulations. That system has been seriously undermined and deformed. International, regional institutions for political, economic and cultural interaction are also experiencing serious crisis these days. Indeed, a lot of the institutions for preserving peace have been created a long time ago, following the Second World War, and the system used to rely not only on the balance of powers, not only on the balance of force, and not only on the rights of the winner, but also on the fact that the founding fathers of that security system used to respect one another and they did not try to extort something from one another by force. They were forced to seek compromise with one another. That system, despite all of its flaws, enabled the world to stay within some limits and tried to somehow mitigate the natural competition of nations, of states. The system of checks and balances that took decades to create and develop, it was something that we should not have destroyed without proposing something to replace it. Because if we had disposed of those institutions, then we would have been left with nothing to deal with the modern-day global challenges. Unfortunately, the United States, who consider themselves the winners of the Cold War, believe that there is no need in those checks and balances. And instead of trying to secure stability in the world, they actually took measures that led to a strong disbalance. The Cold War is over, but it was not over with the signing of peace. It did not end with clear-cut arrangements about some rules and standards to be observed. We have an impression that the so-called winners of the Cold War decided to get the most out of the situation, exploit it as much as possible, and refashion the whole world in accordance with their own interests and ideas. If the entire system of international law and the checks and balances were an obstacle to their intentions, they were immediately proclaimed to be outdated, obsolete, and subject to destruction. This is how a nouveau riche behaves, someone who unexpectedly gets a fortune. They start squandering their gains, believing that this will last forever. And I believe the West has made a lot of blunders because of that. We've entered into a period of mistrust in international politics, and international law used to had to be tramped by issues of political rationale and pragmatism. Total control of international media enabled our counterparts to pass something white for something black and to spin their stories any way they wanted. The opportunity to dominate the war, the abundance of satellites sometimes led to the fact that they were trying to impose their own recipes as something universal. That group had so much ambition that their own opinion developed behind closed doors were peddled as some universal values. The very idea of state sovereignty became relevant. And there was this idea sold that any ruling regime was all the more legitimate than it was loyal to this group. I will give you an opportunity to debate what I'm telling you, and you'll be able to ask questions, but do try to prove me wrong. Ways of influencing those defiant are well known and have been tried and tested so many times. There is media pressure, there is interference in the domestic affairs, and there are attempts at attributing legitimacy to attempts to meddle in the interior affairs. In recent years, we've had evidence that certain national leaders had been blackmailed. The Big Brother has been spending billions of dollars on espionage and surveillance all around the world, including spying on their closest allies. Let's all ask ourselves, how comfortable and safe do we feel living in a world like that? How just and how rational is it? Would you say we have no reasons to be concerned and ask these uncomfortable questions? Maybe the United States is exclusive in pursuing its leadership, and maybe that is a good thing. Maybe them interfering in everyone's relations all over the world is something that brings us peace, stability, prosperity, and democracy, and maybe we all should simply, let them do it to us. I dare say this is not true. Unilateral dictatorship and imposing their own templates on us has actually led to something that was very contrary to what they had intended. Instead of resolving conflicts, we see escalation. Instead of stability, we see increasing chaos. Instead of democracy, we see them supporting some very murky activists, from open Nazis to very dangerous Islamic fundamentalists, because those forces are used initially as instruments, but then they just go out of control, and they're so-called masterminds that get burned on that. I can't help wonder how time and again they continue to repeat their own mistakes. They used to sponsor Islamic extremist movements to fight the Soviet Union. They were tried and tested in Afghanistan and later gave rise to Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The West used to turn a blind eye, or I would actually say even support financially and in media terms to support those terrorists and their invasion in Russia from Central Asian countries. It was only after terrible terrorist attacks in the territory of the United States itself that the West actually came to realize the imminent danger of global terrorism. And I remind you, Russia was the first to support the American nation and lend them a helping hand after the terrorist attack of September 11th, 2001. We have always seen terrorism as a #1 global challenge, one that you cannot block out by using double standards, one that you cannot afford to ignore. We saw our counterparts ostensibly agree with us, but in a while everything just went back to normal, in their opinion. They interfered in Iraq and in Libya, and actually Iraq is now on the brink of disintegration thanks to their action. Iraq is now a playground for terrorists, and it's only thanks to the wisdom of the Egyptian government that helped deliver Egypt from a same fate. In Syria, the United States started to supply terrorists with weapons and hardware, and facilitating an inflow of volunteers into their ranks. Tell me, where do those terrorists get their money, their hardware, their military experts? How did it happen that this Islamic State, the ISIS, has become a strong battle group, essentially? As for financial aid for terrorists, nowadays it's not only revenues from drug trafficking, which, by the way, increased manifold during the US-led military presence in Afghanistan. But we also see terrorist activities nowadays funded by illegal oil trade and oil trafficking. They deliver oil themselves, they transport it illegally, and they sell it illicitly at illegal prices. But if there are sellers, then there are buyers. Someone has been buying that oil, not caring that by virtue of that, they effectively finance terrorists who can one day come to their own countries and start taking lives there. And where do those Islamic terrorists get their new recruits? In Iraq. After the deposition of Saddam Hussein, state institutions were effectively destroyed, including their armed forces. We were actually warning the West back then, saying, look, you are driving all those people, all those males, into unemployment. What are they supposed to do now? How are they going to support themselves and their families? These people used to be the leadership of a relatively large and strong country. What are you leaving them for? Now, what we have seen is tens of thousands of Iraqi army, former Iraqi army servicemen and Ba'athist party members have become rank and file of the Islamic State, and they are military professionals. Russia has warned numerous times how dangerous it is to interfere in the domestic affairs of sovereign states and to aid terrorists. We insisted that organizations fighting against the central government in Syria would be included to the list of terrorist organizations, primarily ISIS. But what have we seen? Our calls were not healed. It seems to us that our Western counterparts keep fighting the vices and the menaces that they brew themselves, that they breed themselves. Dear colleagues, the period of a unipolar world has demonstrated to us vividly that building up a single power center does not make global processes in the world more manageable. On the contrary, this architecture has proved itself highly unstable and incapable of resolving issues such as regional conflicts, terrorism, religious fanaticism, neo-Nazism and chauvinism. At the same time, this architecture has provided plenty of opportunities for public opinion manipulation and trampling on the will of minorities or weaker states by stronger states. A unipolar world is basically an apology of a dictatorship and of hegemony of some states over others. And actually, the unipolar world has proved unaffordable and unmanageable for the self-appointed hegemon themselves. And hence we see these attempts at restoring a bipolar world nowadays as a comfortable vehicle, as a comfortable architecture for preserving American leadership. And it doesn't mean who will play the role as the new empire of evil these days, occupy the spot once taken by the Soviet Union, whether it's going to be Iran, China, or Russia. Once again, we see attempts to split up the world, to draw dividing lines, to hammer together coalitions aimed against someone specifically, rather than in favor of something. Shape an image of an enemy, same as it was back in the time of the Cold War, and get this kind of effective leadership. We all remember how it was at the time of the Cold War. The US used to tell their allies, we have a common enemy, a common foe, that is an empire of evil. We are protecting you, we protect our allies, and that gives us the right to give you orders and to force you to sacrifice your political and economic interests, to incur costs for collective defense that we will be in charge of. Nowadays, in a new world we're living in, we are seeing attempts at pursue similar ways of running the world in order to score political and economic points. Such attempts are not only increasingly detached from reality, they're also in conflict with the global diversity, and they will inevitably call for reciprocal action, and hence they will have an adverse effect. We see what happens when you mix politics with the economy, and when you substitute a logic of cooperation with a logic of confrontation, even when it is contrary to national business interests. Joint economic projects, mutual investments bring countries together, and that's an objective fact. They help us mitigate the existing intergovernmental problems and issues. But nowadays, the global business community is experiencing unprecedented pressure from Western governments. What kind of pragmatism can we talk about when they have this motto, the free world is in danger, democracy is in danger, we need to mobilize to repel the threat? Well, that is mobilization policy as they come. The sanctions are undermining WTO rules, the principles of property. They undermine the model of globalization based on the free market and competition. That is a model that Western countries are the main beneficiaries of. Now they risk losing confidence as the leaders of globalization. My question is, why would they do that? The prosperity of the United States depends greatly upon its investors, those who hold America's state securities and the dollar. We see that confidence being strongly undermined. The Cyprus precedent and the politically motivated sanctions have only increased tendencies for economic and monetary sovereignization, for independence. It is apparent that countries and regions would like to secure themselves against external pressure. We see ever more nations trying to quit their dependence on the dollar by establishing some new reserve currencies and settlement and payment systems. I think our American counterparts are essentially sowing a branch they're sitting on. You cannot mix politics and the economy, but this is what they're doing. I've always believed that politically motivated sanctions would be a mistake that will cost everyone dearly. We understand whose pressure was there to push through these measures, these decisions. But I would like to stress that Russia is not going to act as someone who's been offended. We're not going to ask someone about anything. We are self-sustainable, and we will be working in the current economic situation. We'll be more proactive in our reforms, and this external pressure will only consolidate us, as it has happened so many times in the past. It will keep us from growing complacent, and it will make us focus on the key directions for development. Of course, those sanctions are hampering us. They seek to urge us to isolate ourselves in terms of politics, economics, culture, but the world has changed drastically. And we are not going to close ourselves, to shut ourselves off. We are not going to go for some kind of isolated development. We will always be in favor of developing our political and economic relations, and we count on the attitude of the leading business communities of the world. It has been said numerously during the deliberations here that Russia is turning its back on its Western partners, on Europe, and looking for new strategic partners in Asia. I can tell you that is not so. Russia's active policies in the Asia-Pacific did not start yesterday because of the sanctions. It dates back several years. And like with so many other countries, including Western countries, our rationale in promoting our Asian cooperation was merely the fact that Asia, that Southeast Asia especially, was gaining an ever-increasing role in global politics and especially the global economy. Like I said, everyone does it, and we will do that too, especially considering the fact that Russia has a vast share of its territory located in Asia. So why would not we use that opportunity? That would not be reasonable. Joint integration projects and the economic cooperation provide Russia a serious incentive for its own domestic economic development. Present-day global trends show us that dependence upon a single global power will decrease in the years to come. And actually, even American and Western experts acknowledge that. And we might see in the global politics the same trends that we see in the global economy, and that is intense competition in certain niche, rapidly and fast-changing leaders in certain areas. That's all possible. Of course, humanitarian factors will play an increased role, including education, research, culture, and so on. And of course, that will influence international relations, because soft power will depend more from the real achievements in terms of human capital rather on propaganda proficiency. At the same time, a polycentric world that we see emerging will not strengthen stability as such. Rather, on the contrary, a global equilibrium becomes a rather difficult task, a rather difficult equation. So what are we looking at if we choose to live without rules, no matter how uncomfortable and stringent those rules are? And now such a scenario cannot be ruled out either, considering the tension in the world nowadays. Some trends enable us to give a forecast, and that is not very optimistic unless we manage to create a clear system of mutual responsibilities and arrangements. Then we will see trends for global anarchy increasing. Even today, we see an increased risk of conflicts, of a number of conflicts involving a number of large powers, and together with traditional state-on-state contradictions and disparities, you actually see new types of conflicts at the borders of some global civilizational areas or masses. We see those borderline states becoming the arena for conflicts. We will speak about Ukraine a lot, but of course I think that this conflict reveals the whole split and the whole cleavage, and I don't think this is the last conflict we are to see. This conflict can actually touch off the process of destruction of the non-proliferation conflict, and it was the US that actually started that process by quitting on the non-proliferation treaty in 2010, and they continue doing that by pushing through with their global missile defense program that they've been consistently implementing and pursuing. And I would like to emphasize that Russia was not the one who started it. We are going back to a situation where countries are only kept from conflicting with one another by a mere deterrence, by a fear of a global war. We see weapons being used extensively anywhere and everywhere without any mandates from the UN Security Council. And once the UN Security Council refuses to validate such action, it gets proclaimed an outdated institution. And many nations in the world see their own solution for securing themselves in developing their own nuclear arms, which is very dangerous. We insist that negotiation must continue. We are not just in favor of a negotiation. We insist on negotiation to continue the reduction of our nuclear arsenals. The less nuclear warheads we have worldwide, the better. We are ready to some very substantive, serious discussion on reducing our nuclear arsenals. But we do expect it to be a serious discussion with no double standards used. What am I talking about? Nowadays, a lot of high-precision arms are actually close to weapons of mass destruction. And if we give up nuclear potentials, countries that lead in producing high-precision weapons system will get a clear competitive edge. A strategic parity will be upset, and that will prove a threat to global security. There will be this threat of a global preemptive strike. So the risks are increasing instead of decreasing. We also see a greater risk of conflicts erupting based on religion, ethnicity, and ideology. Such conflicts form around themselves an environment of lawlessness, where terrorists feel at home, and just trivial criminals, drug traffickers, and human traffickers feel at home in such an environment. Our Western counterparts used to try to exploit those situations by engineering so-called orange revolutions and by trying to court these extremist movements. But now the genie is out of the bottle, and we see that even those proponents of this managed chaos concept, they don't know what to do with that genie anymore. We see growing discussion and debates in the Western academic and expert community. It would be enough to look at the headlines in the Western media. The same people are first portrayed as fighters for democracy and then as Islamic radicals. First, the Western media tell us about people's revolutions, and then they get described as coups and riots and unrest. In such a situation, it is high time we tried to agree on the basic things. It is extremely important. It is much better than isolating ourselves from each other, especially considering the fact that we're faced with common challenges and issues. We are in the same boat. The best solution would be cooperation among nations, a joint search for solutions and a joint risk management. Unfortunately, some of our counterparts only remember of this necessity when it responds to their interests, when it's in line with their interests. Unfortunately, such objectives are too difficult to achieve sometimes. So difficult it is to overcome our disagreements, especially when talking about countries with various historic and cultural backgrounds. Nonetheless, we do have historic examples when common principles and common values would actually help us achieve some success. I can remind you of the Syrian chemical weapons issue and the Iranian nuclear program negotiations, our work on the North Korean track. It also has a record of some positive results. Why not use this experience in the future in addressing regional as well as global issues and challenges? What could be a legal basis for a new world order that would provide for stability and security while stimulating competition and preventing new monopolies from emerging? I don't think anyone would be able to give a comprehensive and exhaustive recipe or recommendation to this end. It will take joint activities, joint effort by governments, the expert community, the business community, and fora such as this one. But it's obvious that we can only arrive at some specific results if the global players will agree on some basic interests and on rational self-restraint. If they show an experience of responsible leadership, we need to set the boundaries for unilateral action and define the necessity for multilateral mechanism. We need to resolve the dilemma between international action to support human rights and humanitarian issues and the principle of state sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs. Very often, such trends actually lead to foreign meddling in some very complicated processes and provoke the world's leading players. Issues of sovereignty become highly important for preserving global stability. Of course, discussing criteria for the use of force is a very difficult one, and it can hardly be separated from the interests of specific countries. But it would be even more dangerous to have no arrangements and no rules in place. No arrangements and no rules in place. It would be more dangerous to have a situation where meddling in someone's international affairs would be seen as truly necessary and indispensable. We need to have a rule-based international system based on principles such as truth and respect for your partners and their interests. And that should seem like such an obvious formula, but if we were just to follow it and implement it consistently, it would already make a big change. It would help us restore confidence for the existing international institutions without the necessity to build something from scratch. This is not greenfield, especially considering the fact that those institutions created after the end of the Second World War are universal, and they can be made to reflect the relevant realities of today. This concerned the UN, whose central role is indispensable, and the OSCE, whose 40 years have proved it as a mechanism for promoting cooperation and security in the Euro-Atlantic region. And nowadays, in resolving the crisis in southeastern Ukraine, the OSCE has played a very positive role. We see various threats emerging and the global system being ever less manageable. In this situation, we need a new global consensus. It's not about some local deals or splitting up spheres of influence in the classic 19th century diplomacy style. We need a new edition of mutual dependence. That is something that we should not fear. It is actually a very strong instrument in favor of coordination, especially considering the growth and the strengthening of certain regions of the world. And that asks for these new powers, these new powerhouses to be institutionalized and for their interactions with other powerhouses to be codified. For us to establish this kind of dialogue, we need to move from the premise that all the existing international institutions in integration vehicles should have a similar right to self-development. They need to be complementary rather than conflicting among one another. A destructive line that used to be contradictional, that used to be conflicting, would actually lead those institutions to risk complete destruction. I would like to remind you of the events of last year. We used to warn our American and European partners that a hasty decision, a hasty backdoor decision on an association agreement with Ukraine was fraught with risks, and we were not even hinting at political risks. We only meant risks for the Ukrainian economy, because such rapid, hasty steps would actually influence the interests of third parties, including Russia as one of Ukraine's major economic partners. I would like to remind you that it took Russia 19 years to negotiate its accession to the WTO. That was hard work, but eventually we did manage to arrive at a certain consensus. Why is that not being reflected on these days? Because while pursuing an association agreement with Ukraine, our Western partners would be effectively entering the Russian market with their goods and services through a backdoor, without even giving Russia an early warning of that. We tried to express our opinions in our dealings with Europe over Ukraine for a long time while being polite about it. But we were told this was none of our business, and that was that. All the discussion we got instead of a civilized dialogue, no matter how complicated it would have been. So at the end of the day, they've thrown two nations into a mutual conflict with thousands of victims, with that much money being spent, with that much infrastructure being destroyed. And I've been asking them why. No one can answer me. They just shrug their shoulders. Well, you should not have supported those developments to start with. Like I said before, the former Ukrainian President Yanukovych had signed all the agreements and agreed to everything. What was the point of toppling him? Was that a civilized way of dealing with the situation? I believe those who continue breeding those color-coded revolutions, they consider themselves some kind of genius masterminds, and they just cannot stop. I'm convinced that interactions among regional structures must be based on mutual trust and respect. And the creation of the Eurasian Economic Union, economic community is a brilliant example of that. Our partners have been warning us in advance and updating us on their changes to their own economic regulation, which are fully in line with the World Trade Organization rules. And they are also similar to the processes of the European Union. We have been applying for joint activities with the EU repeatedly, but we were turned down time and again. What was wrong with that? I heard many times from our European partners about the necessity to form a single economic and cultural space from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Dear colleagues, Russia has made its choice. Our priorities are in favor of further improving democratic institutions and developing our economy. Considering the global trends of today, we want to consolidate our society based on traditional values and patriotism. We have a peaceful, integrational agenda. We work actively with our counterparts within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, and others. Our policy pursues unification rather than breakdowns. It is also baseless to argue that Russia is trying to restore some kind of an empire and trying to destroy the sovereignty of its neighboring states. Russia does not demand some kind of an exclusive role in the world. I would like to emphasize that we do respect the interests of others, but we would like our interests and our opinions to be respected likewise. It is obvious that the world has now entered into a period of a deep and profound transformation, and we all need to be cautious and very deliberate in order to avoid some hasty and dangerous steps. Some of the players in the global relations have forgotten those rules in the years following the end of the Cold War. We need to go back to that. Otherwise, some of their ideas might prove serious delusion, and the current trend might prove to be the beginning of destruction of the global world order. We're talking about some serious hard work, but we once managed to develop rules of conduct following the Second World War. We managed to agree in the 1970s in Helsinki over the Helsinki process. So it is our task to come to terms in this new stage of development. Thank you very much.